Welcome everybody to the AALU post-election webinar. A lot to talk about here. This is Marc Cadin, Chief Operating Officer at AALU. I want to thank MetLife for your sponsorship. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to take about 30 minutes today, and I'm pleased to have three special guests with me. First, Ken Kies, former Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation. Interesting note about that. The Speaker of the House at the time that Ken was Chief of Staff was Newt Gingrich, a prominent advisor to President-elect Trump. We also have Jeff Ricchetti, a Democratic lobbyist, been involved in a lot of administrations, in transitions, etc. And we have Justin Brown, who leads our public policy team. I want to remind everyone that this webinar is meant to be interactive. If you have a question, please submit it using the Q&A box on your control panel. We're going to make sure we get to as many questions as we can over the next 30 minutes. And if we don't answer your question, then on the call, then please know that we will follow up and answer everybody's question. A member of the AALU Government Affairs team will get in touch with you. So please, again, we want this to be interactive. Please provide your questions using the Q&A box. So before I turn it over to Ken, Jeff, and Justin, I just thought I'd offer a couple of thoughts about the election, about what it means, and what our plan is. First off, there's no doubt that Tuesday night was perhaps the most surprising and historic election in American history. For me, what it reminds us all that we are living in very uncertain times. If anybody were to predict what next week or next month or next year could do with any degree of certainty, given the uncertain times that we live in, it would just be insane. We have to recognize that we don't know what the future brings, but we're going to give you our best advice and analysis. And because one thing's for certain, what we know that in an uncertain time, it's more important than ever to plan. We want to make sure that the products that you've helped put in place with your clients stay in place. We want to make sure that the clients that you're talking to about products that you know they need, whether it's on the corporate or on the individual side, stay in place and are put in place. So we believe that planning is central to what the American people need, and we know that they need more insurance, not less. And they need to do more planning, not less. And you're at the center of that. The second thought I'd like to just mention that we've been preparing for this reality for a number of months. We've had board meetings, we've had working group calls, we've had committee calls, we've had outside counsel engagement. We all know in an American democracy that one of two sides is going to win, and it was either going to be Clinton or Trump. And in either instance, we knew that there were challenges ahead. And so we've been preparing, but perhaps more important than the preparation is our track record. We've been through trying times before, whether it was the proposal that passed out of the Senate Finance Committee on corporate and life insurance, which would have eliminated the marketplace, or the estate tax repeal fights in 01, 02, 04, 05. All of those fights we were advocating on behalf of our members, and so we have been here before. We know that what you do for your clients is good public policy. It's good for the country, and again, people need more of it, not less. And the last comment I'd make is the strategic direction that AALU's board adopted, and that we've been driving at. We announced it at the last annual meeting. It's really centered on alignment. We know there are a number of life insurance industry groups out there. We speak with slightly different messages. We're not as effective and efficient as we can in terms of truly aligning the resources and driving a unified message. It's more important than ever, as is programs like federal advocacy services and access, changes in AALU's business model that will help us reach more people more efficiently and ultimately engage them in the political process. So our job today and going forward is to serve you so that you can serve your clients. This will be the first of a regular set of communications. When uncertainty is at its greatest, communication needs to be most regular. So you can expect to hear from us regularly, written, teleseminars, etc. And we want to hear from you as to what you need. You can email us at communications@aalu.org. You can email me, Cadin@aalu.org, or Chris Morton, Justin, anybody on the AALU team. Please let us know what you need from us, what you're hearing for your clients, and how we can better serve you. So with that, let's turn to you, Ken. You've been involved in, you know Speaker Gingrich well. He's been involved. You studied this stuff, been through a bunch of presidential elections. Maybe you could just give us the top line on what happened on Tuesday night.
Well, what happened on Tuesday was I played golf, and that was great. But Tuesday night was a little different. And I would say 4 things that I would identify that were big. And one was the monumental failure of pollsters and pundits. Enough said on that because people are writing about it forever. Second, and this is not getting written about much, but it's huge, to use a term, the direction of the federal judiciary changed overnight. There are currently 52 pending judicial nominations that Obama has set up, none of which will get processed. And obviously his Supreme Court nominee won't get processed either. So the longer term implications for that are really big. The third thing is that all the Washington insiders got a big time wake up call. Registered lobbyists gave $1.3 million to Hillary, and they gave $74,000 to Trump. So they placed the bet and they lost big time. And then finally, in terms of outcome, basically Republicans ran the table. Obviously they won the presidency, net 2 loss in the Senate, which is lower than anybody expected. In the House, a net 7 loss, it looks like. In terms of governor's offices, maybe a net 1 or 2. It depends on the recount in North Carolina. And I think they picked up a couple state legislative chambers, and they were already at the highest level they've been since 1928. So it was a big night for Republicans pretty much across the board, except for losing a few marijuana votes. So there you have it, Mark.
So Jeff, Ken mentioned pollsters, media, establishment, etc. How could everybody get this as wrong as they got it?
Well, I actually think everybody knew this race was going to be tight, and it was compressing as we were going into election night. And clearly the trajectory was not good for Clinton at that time. All of the polls have within them underlying assumptions about turnout, and obviously the turnout was different from what their modeling was assuming. And I think if you looked at most of the battleground states, that's why we were up till 2 in the morning, is that most of the races were those 1% races that were well within the margins of error for most of the polls. So while people would like to think that these polls are definitive statements, they're just that, and most of them were fairly close or tight, particularly at the presidential level where there was a fair amount of data to represent it. Just a couple comments in response to what Kenneth outlined in terms of what the takeaways from the election were. It's a simple reminder that, in fact, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, as did Al Gore. And it's only to say, not that that means anything as to who will or won't be president or whether it is or isn't valid. It's simply to suggest that sometimes people overread the outcome of an election and whether there's a strong mandate to be derived from that. And my suggestion would be, in this election particularly, if you assume that there's some compelling mandate here for a given direction, I think you would be overreading the election, particularly in light of the divisiveness within both parties with respect to what the agenda is for that party. These were not clearly defined agendas of Republican and Democrats in contrast and in competition for the support of the country. And I think we're going to see that play out as we look at what is going to be happening in the next year and measure, frankly, how the white working class vote, which delivered Trump the presidency, how they would react to that agenda as it unfolds.
Well, we're getting a number of good questions about Dodd-Frank, Supreme Court, and the estate tax issues, so keep those questions coming. Again, this is Marc Cadin. I'm joined by Ken Kies, Jeff Ricchetti, and Justin Brown on our webinar sponsored by MetLife. And Ken, so we'll have a lot more discussion and punditry about why the election went the way, but it did, so it really doesn't matter. Let's try to get into what this means from a presidential and congressional relationship standpoint. Obviously, President-elect Trump and Speaker Ryan had a bit of a rocky relationship during the campaign. Is this all forgiven now? Do you expect, based on all your discussions, a unified Republican approach on the big issue?
It's going to be somewhat unified, but let's be serious. It's not going to be perfect, and it never is for either party. But in terms of big issues, I think the two where Trump and Republicans are most likely to be able to work together is tax reform and repeal of Obamacare. Immigration reform is a much tougher one for a whole variety of reasons. In terms of judicial appointments, my guess is the Senate under McConnell will work well with the White House. And it partly depends on who does Trump put into key positions. And the key positions that I would identify that are important to us are the Chief of Staff, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, the head of DOL, whose job's going to be to get rid of the fiduciary rule, the head of Treasury, just to name a couple. And we'll probably start to get some of those in the next couple weeks. Most people think the Chief of Staff would be announced at least in the next 2 weeks. And so that's going to partly shape how well Republicans in Congress can work with the Trump administration. But all the nasty things, actually Ryan never really said anything nasty about Trump. It's more Trump about Ryan. But I think they buried the hatchet Tuesday night. And both of them, it's in both their best interest to actually produce. Because if Republicans don't produce, because they're not going to get any support from Democrats in Congress, but if they don't produce, they're going to lose big time in the 2018 election, and I think they know that.
Well, and we're getting a bunch of questions about DOL and the estate tax. So again, we're going to dive into that here in about 30 seconds. So keep those questions coming. We do. There is word, Ken, isn't there, that Trump and Speaker Ryan are going to have lunch today in Washington? Is that correct?
I didn't actually know that, but that would certainly make sense because Obama probably won't give him lunch when he goes to the White House. So
fair enough. So Justin, I want to get you in here. I want to get you in here, Justin Brown. You're very close to Chairman Brady. Done a lot with him through the years, both before he was chairman and after. And from your perspective, what do you think happens by August of next year? And then Ken and Jeff, love for you to comment as well.
Well, I think the big thing and the chairman's been very clear about this publicly and privately as well. In fact, when we were in Houston a little while ago, the way he put it is we're going to have a major tax reform bill within the first 2 quarters, is how he termed it then. The debate was, if Hillary won, would they still release the bill they have this blueprint, which is a series of concepts on tax reform. Would they turn that into statutory text and release it as a bill? And they were having that debate then. But of course, now with Trump being elected, it's almost clear that they will. I can't imagine that they wouldn't. So that's what I would expect. In terms of major legislation from them, that committee before August. And one other thing, this is just kind of a side note, but it's interesting, and I know it's something that's being talked about right now. Just having members like Mr. Renacci, who's on the Ways and Means Committee and has his own tax reform plan, which it was very atypical that a member would do that when the chairman and the speaker offered had the party's plan, if you will, offered before that. But he recently sent a letter saying that they should delay leadership elections scheduled for 11/15 currently, and that's caused a lot of consternation on committees. So, we still have some of those things to work out as well.
So Ken, maybe you can speak specifically to tax reform, Obamacare repeal, the estate tax. From your vantage point, what does the first 8 months of next year look like as it relates to the tax agenda?
Okay, so the key time frame I see is between when the Congress comes back in January, when Trump takes office, and the August recess. And that's the magic window of opportunity the first-term presidents have to do big things. And I can tell you, when Paul Ryan was running as Romney's running mate in 2012, he and Romney sat down after the debates, but before the election, and laid out a 7-month plan under which they were going to do tax reform, entitlement reform, and fiscal reform. In Paul Ryan's mind, that plan has just now been transferred to 2017. And to the extent that Newt is an advisor to Trump, he'll be advising him along the same lines, that you've got to get those big things done in your first 7 months, because once your House members come back in the fall of 2017, they start to worry about their own elections, and how brave they are at that point in terms of casting tough votes starts to decline precipitously. So what I'm telling you is actually based on history, and specifically, very quickly, Reagan in '81, his Economic Recovery Tax Act, the biggest tax cut in history at the time, was done by the August recess. Clinton in '93, his budget deal was done by the August recess. George W. Bush, his $1.3 trillion tax cut was done by May, notwithstanding the debacle in Florida in 2000. And in the case of Obama, his children's health insurance and his $800 billion slush fund / stimulus package, was done by the August recess. And so I think that's clearly what they have in mind, and they have in mind doing tax reform, repeal and replace of Obamacare. I doubt that they can get immigration reform done in that time frame, but they're going to want to get this stuff done ahead of September, because the debt ceiling is going to have to be addressed again. And the last thing that Ryan is going to want to be in a position to do is to take a debt ceiling increase to his Tea Party guys when they haven't gotten tax reform and Obamacare repealed. And so that's another major factor that is going to push them to move as promptly as they can. Right now, you asked about the estate tax. You'd have to say right now the probability that it gets repealed is probably near 80%. In my judgment, the key to stopping that is to convince the Republican leadership that having a President Trump sign a repeal of the estate tax from a PR perspective will be a disaster, because of the extent to which he and his family will permanently benefit from it. So just going to tell you all the reasons he can get the left-wing groups revved up. Unfortunately, they're going to be not terribly relevant to the outcome. But if we don't convince the Republican leadership that it is not in their best interest to let this happen, that to me is the best opportunity to stop this from happening.
So Jeff, Ken, I want to stay with you for a second, because there's been a lot of confusion about what reconciliation means, and the Republicans have 52 senators. That's obviously not enough to stop a filibuster. So in your mind, how does reconciliation play, and what is the importance of the 51 vote threshold in the Senate?
Okay, so it's a certainty that the bills I'm referring to, repeal of Obamacare and state tax, will be done under reconciliation. And what that means is they pass a budget resolution. It has reconciliation instructions. Once that happens, the critical aspect of this is it only needs 51 votes in the Senate. It's not subject to a filibuster. I actually think in the Senate, at least on tax reform, they may get a few Democrats. On infrastructure, they may get a few Democrats in the House and the Senate. But the key is, under reconciliation, you only need 51 votes. There is a popular misconception, partly because of the 2001 Act, that if you're under reconciliation, you can only do a 10-year bill and it sunsets. That is factually incorrect on two fronts. The first is the period of the budget resolution can be longer than 10 years. The 74 Budget Act doesn't specify the period of the budget resolution. You could have a 30-year budget resolution, which sounds a little long until you realize when the Social Security actuaries do their annual report, it's a 75-year horizon. But the other reason has to do with Obamacare, and that is for this reason. The rule under reconciliation is you look at the first period of the budget resolution. Let's say it is 10 years. Then you look at the second 10 years. And the question that the Joint Committee and CBO jointly have to answer is, in the second 10 years, in my example, does it add to the deficit or not? The 97 Act was done under budget reconciliation, but it was permanent law because in the second 10 years, the Medicare savings overwhelmed the cost of the tax bill. So when I did the tax estimate on the 97 Act when I was at the Joint Committee, and CBO did its estimate of the Medicare savings, the Medicare savings exceeded the cost of the tax bill, and therefore it was permanent law. There was no need to sunset it. This time around, the repeal of Obamacare may produce a lot of budget savings. I think it obviously depends on how it's replaced, but it could produce a lot of budget savings, in which case that second budget period, whatever it happens to be, might not add to the deficit. So those are, it's getting a little too in the weeds, but it's important because it goes to the issue of whether or not, what's the probability of a permanent tax bill out of this process that could happen next year.
Well, Ken, I've got a number of questions about priorities, including from Russell Vandeveld. And you mentioned Obamacare repeal, you mentioned tax reform, you mentioned a number of things, and there's a corporate element of tax reform and an individual element of tax reform. In your mind, will this be the Trump administration putting that massive bill together? Will that be their number one priority?
I think the number one, I mean, the papers today are reporting the number one priority is the repeal of Obamacare. But I think the way it will end up getting done, and there's still decisions to be made, but the way it is likely to get done is in one big budget deal, which has the repeal and replace of Obamacare and the tax bill, and maybe the infrastructure package, although actually I think they can do the infrastructure package outside of reconciliation and probably still get it passed. Or maybe they have separate reconciliation instructions and they get one reconciliation instruction for the infrastructure bill and one for Obamacare and the tax reform. So I think those will be their priorities. And as I said, I think they're done by the August recess.
So Jeff, Ken talked about reconciliation. He talked specifically about the estate tax, 51 vote threshold, offsetting it with basically Obamacare repeal on the spending side, and that there's an 80% probability the estate tax is repealed. In your mind, is this permanent?
Nothing's permanent, and we're seeing it with the threat of repeal of the Obamacare Healthcare Affordable Care Act. I do agree with Ken that I believe they will pursue what they can in the first 8 or so months. They'll do it through reconciliation. I'm a little more skeptical about their capacity to be able to make these things permanent. You know, Bill Clinton, when he did his tax bill with 50 votes and the vice president breaking the tie, was able to make it permanent because he was raising revenue and the out-year revenue implication was positive. I think they will be very challenged in light of what they intend to include in reconciliation to get a positive revenue effect in the out years. I think that would involve massive entitlement reforms, which are not what President Trump campaigned on. And I think those will be very challenging. I expect them to have considerable difficulty with their intent to repeal Obamacare. The healthcare industry, both the insurers that you represented, the doctors and the hospitals at the time of its passage supported it. And there is a lot at stake in it being repealed with 20 million people potentially losing their coverage. And so I think we can be fairly confident, and I agree completely with Ken, that they will move a reconciliation package between now and August. What's in that package is what we were going to debate intensely for the next 10 months. And I do think they will get to, yes, I think they'll get to a product, but it is going to be an excruciating process. And we know what their desires are. Their desire is to repeal Obamacare. Their desire is to do what was outlined in Ryan's proposal with respect to repeal of the estate tax, repeal of the alternative minimum tax, and dramatic and fundamental rate reform and rate reduction. We also know from scoring of that proposal that Tax Policy Center scores it as losing $4 trillion in revenue in the first year, and another $4 trillion in the second 10 years. And so I think those reconciliation challenges in terms of trying to make it permanent will be very severe. That $4 trillion number I cited assumes $3 trillion in offsets in their calculation. It would otherwise cost $7 trillion in the first 10 years. And so there's a fair amount of pain associated with getting the reform that's on the table achieved. Those people affected by those $3 trillion in revenues are not going to sit on their hands. They're going to vigorously advocate that they not be part of the offset and pay for the other changes involved in the package. And so it's just a long-winded way of saying there will be a very intense negotiation about what is in this. I do expect that if they include things like repeal of Obamacare and other things, then it will be done on a partisan basis. In spite of the fact that there are gettable Democrats to do something more tailored. And we will witness the process of its broadening and narrowing over the course of the next year until they hone in on what, in fact, they can get over the goal line. And I'm sure they'll try to get as much over the goal line as they can. With respect to specifically the estate tax, I think that in and of itself is very hard to do on a permanent basis, as we saw when they did it in '01. And even though they delayed the implementation of it till the last year of the 10-year window when they did it at that time, the cost is dramatically less because we're at a baseline of a $5 million exemption, or close to $11 million per couple, and a 40% rate instead of a $1 million exemption and a 45% rate, which was the baseline when they did it last time. But I'm certain they will pursue it. They've committed to doing so, and I'm certain we'll have a vigorous debate about whether they're successful at it and whether it is an element that gets included in this multiple trillion-dollar bill that we're talking about here.
And I think just real quick on estate tax, I think Ken's point about dampening the appetite for it is an important one. We've had numerous conversations already with Republican tax writers on that issue, and obviously publicly what they say is different from what they tell us privately, but a number of them basically feel like they've already solved the problem with the fiscal cliff deal and with the unification of the gift and estate tax and that sort of thing. So, our key strategy moving forward, into Mark's point about having our backs on the wall, against the wall, we've been there before, is to continue to sort of dampen the enthusiasm for estate tax repeal as a policy priority for Republicans, especially in light of a billionaire president who would benefit personally from it.
Agree completely with that being the argument.
So Jeff, we've got a couple minutes left. I want to get to. We've got a million questions on the DOL, but Jeff, I have a quick question for you. If Republicans repeal the estate tax through reconciliation, and then a Democrat wins in 2020, is it possible to reinstate it with potentially a Democratic Congress if there is a kind of a similar wave in the opposite direction that we saw in 2010, 2014 against the existing administration?
Unquestionably, as you know, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama campaigned on lowering the exemption level and increasing the rate, and so and certainly the dynamic that is existing right now with respect to income inequality would invite their returning to this topic. This isn't going away. There's too damn much revenue associated with it, and as long as there's a Congress, we'll be having a debate about the estate tax.
And Ken, we talked about the estate tax. In your mind, gift tax, is that will that also be repealed in your judgment?
Probably, but the gift tax raises a bunch of income tax issues that are really kind of messy, and so I would say it's a less clear picture with respect to that. So that I would say that's yet to be determined.
Okay. Now, Ken, let's stick with you. We've got a ton of questions on the DOL about obviously there's tax reform. We've got to try to find the opportunities. We've got to advocate for existing members. We've got to provide communications, etc. There's a lot of defense to be played, perhaps some offense, and that's something we're working through within the tax reform construct. But it seems like DOL is nothing but offense, right? Maybe talk about what's going to happen in your mind in the Trump administration as it relates to the Department of Labor's rule. What are the options? What happens on this regulatory matter?
Okay, so I think likely between now and when Trump takes office, or immediately after he takes office, they'll announce that they're withdrawing a number of DOL rules, and you'll get a bunch of pointy-headed administrative procedure lawyers who will tell you, well, you've got to follow the APA, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is it's going away, I think. I'll be astonished. It may take a couple months to do it, but if they announce up front, we're withdrawing this thing, people will basically know they don't have to comply with it. And it's not just the fiduciary rule, it's the overtime rule. The DOL has been a cesspool in terms of generating obscene regulatory procedures that are an enormous burden the U.S. business community. It's part of the reason the stock market is flying through the roof right now, notwithstanding the fact everybody predicted if Obama or Trump got nominated, it would crash. It's the reaction of regulatory relief, at least in part. So the DOL will go on. It's just a question of what steps they're going to have to follow to make sure it happens. But I think it's done easily in the first 6 months of 2017.
Okay, so we're at 11:30. We want to talk about the plan. We've got questions on 2704 regs, Supreme Court nominees, Dodd-Frank generally, corporate rate targets. There are a number of questions that we have, and again, we will get back with you, questions about reconciliation, but we do want to respect everybody's time, and we want to hear more from you. Email us at communications@AALU.org. Continue to submit your questions. We will get back to them. But Justin, we've talked a lot about the election and what it means. And obviously there's more work to decipher what it means and advocate within the environment. You mentioned that we've been here before. We've obviously been preparing, you, Chris Morton, the board, et cetera. Maybe you can talk specifically about kind of the top priority items that AALU is doing and will continue to do as we go through the transition period and into the next administration in Congress.
Well, like you said, we've been planning for it. And so a lot of this includes a lot of the blocking and tackling of advocacy work. So continuing high-level meetings with staff and members of Congress on a variety of tax and regulatory issues, getting clients involved in specific instances. We've done that before very successfully, and we have targets for doing that again in the future on different issues. Bringing members in, both AALU members, that is, both sort of in a targeted way with our ambassadors, as well as a broader way with group fly-ins. That's a big part of our strategy over the next let's say, call it the first 100 days of this new administration. And then also, I think you really need to take a parallel perspective on advocacy, given what's happened and the change in nature of what it takes to be successful in Washington. And what we're doing there, this is sort of under the rubric of doing some things differently and innovatively, is really taking a look at more public affairs, media engagement, more direct-to-consumer engagement, apart from the client engagement piece, and basically leveraging, if you will, big data to ensure that our message of retirement savings and long-term protection and how important those things are for a healthy economy get to members of Congress. The other thing, Mark, I do want to mention is we do want to provide our members with the best client guidance, let's call it, possible. Granted, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of decisions that even members don't know what's going on, and members of Congress, as well as the administration, to the extent it's not even staff, and there's thousands of jobs they have to fill, and that will all have an impact. But that said, we will be doing our best to provide our members with bullets, with facts, what have you, about how we see the landscape here in DC in terms of how it impacts the products they sell to their clients. And with these bullets, with these facts, they can have these discussions with advisors, with CFOs, wherever the case may be.
Well, thanks for that, Justin. Just to summarize what Justin just said, number one is always about engaging our members, right? We have to, the importance of citizen engagement has never been more relevant. Ken, Jeff, Justin, they're all, smart guys and, high-priced lobbyists, et cetera. But the reality is there's nothing more important than citizen engagement. And that is more relevant today than ever before, particularly in light of Tuesday's results. I think the second piece is really about aligning the industry, right? We have to make sure we're speaking with a unified voice, that we are efficient, effective in terms of bringing the groups together and advocating on behalf of whether it's permanent estate tax reform, about the importance of corporate uses of the products, about DOL repeal, or about an offensive approach that will actually help our members and advisors across the country sell more and provide better advice to more people. So we have to align the industry. We've got to innovate, whether it's through the digital platform, Justin said, to engage consumers, whether it's through the federal advocacy services, whether it's part of our annual meeting next year, which will be in the middle of this tax reform, entitlement reform debate. We have to continue to innovate. And then the last thing is we're going to communicate. Please let us know what you need, what you think, your ideas, suggestions, opportunities. Email any of us on the AALU team or communications@aalu.org. But we thank you very much for your support, for your engagement, for your investment in AALU, and we look forward to continuing to work with you throughout the next coming days, weeks, and months. So thank you very much for your time today. Ken, Jeff, Justin, thank you for your comments and expertise and for what you do on behalf of the membership every single day. Thank you very much, everyone.